annual DPI NGO conference. This is a conference that happens each year, and it honors and invites into its process NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who are formally associated with the Department of Public Information, DPI, as well as ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council here at UN headquarters. Now, this numbers into the thousands of NGOs around the world who are affiliated, as of course Fairleigh Dickinson University is with ECOSOC, and one of its very proud members. One of the things I found while coming into the process was that there was no youth subcommittee. There was a subcommittee on workshops, on media, on outreach, on many different areas, as you might imagine, going into planning a very large annual conference at the United Nations that would involve plenaries, workshops, special events, etc. But there was no focus on youth. And with the help of the then DPI NGO representative, Mr. Paul Hofel, we created an opportunity to actually bring young people into the process of that conference. And it was there that I began to understand a bit why the situation is the way it is, and also what I had hoped to offer as the opportunity to change and allow more young people into the process. So at this point, we began to work with young people on ancillary matters that would happen outside of and around the DPI NGO conference. This led us to, again, question, as Ambassador Kamal has, why it is so difficult, why the UN relationship with youth became so opaque. One of the things that I found that I thought was very interesting and useful, and perhaps might offer us some insight into this right at the get-go, was that because of our proximity and location, I should say, here in New York City, it tended to be that those young people who wanted to be involved were here locally, tended to be the more affluent members of the developed world, and I believe that the United Nations was very wise to be cautious on how it opened the process for young people during a period in the 80s and 90s when it considered this, so that it wasn't overrun by the same, again, sort of gang of mafia of the developed world, the world of New York City, and became a New York-centric or U.S.-centric or developed world-centric group of young people. So the UN placed very strong strictures on how youth could become involved, in essence to level the playing field, so that every young person around the world could have the same chance, and that should be applauded. Secondly, the UN then limited the range of young people who could apply. They needed to be active master's students, and they needed to go through a series of rigorous application procedures in order to ensure that the UN was bringing in the best and the brightest from around the world. Now, that said, we still have a situation, as Ambassador Kamal mentioned, where much of the developing world is under 25. I was fortunate to visit the country of Jordan, for example, in 2008 as a guest of King Abdullah and Elie Wiesel at the 4th Petra Conference of Nobel Laureates. And I led a group of 50 young people who were attending that event. And we found during our stay this amazing fact, just to reiterate it, that over 70% of the Jordanian population is under 25 years old. 70% of the country under 25, many of them unemployed. So this again goes to the issue of needing to once again really address the issue of youth beyond the strictures that were applied to this first group that came in, and that's what led to the consideration to begin an annual youth assembly at the United Nations, which actually began as a kind of housewarming. The initial idea that came out of the outreach committee of the NGO DPI Executive Committee, which is a committee that is representative of the leaders of the NGO movement within the Department of Public Information, attempted to really bring together young people, number one, as a way to introduce them to the House. So that's really how we began.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions which arise from your initial statement. The first is that you yourself have identified the fact that youth is not just Western youth. But if you are sitting in New York, there is obviously a logistic advantage for Western youth to participate in the Youth Assembly because you are here. I want to know, how does a youth from Mongolia or from Timor-Leste participate? What is your funding process? How do you give due priority to the developing countries, which is where the youth is really located? That's question number one. Question number two is that we have a number of other initiatives in the United Nations. You have, for example, Cyber School Bus. You have the Model UN program. These are all youth-oriented programs. What is your coordination and link with these programs so that we are not dispersing our effort, but that we are working according to a coordinated strategy rather than eroding ourselves in different tangents? And finally, question number three, that one of the greatest force multipliers that we have in the world today is the internet and video conferencing, Skype. It's no longer necessary to be physically face-to-face. Here we are sitting, talking to Vancouver at the other end of the world. And not quite, but almost. And so the question is, how are you using the internet and information technology in building up your strength, keeping in mind how the internet has been used in the past? For example, in the case of the treaty banning landmines, it was entirely done over the internet against the wishes of powerful governments and successfully done. And so where is the internet in your calculations?
Once again, thank you. Those are very thoughtful questions, and questions that come up all the time, actually. So let me start with one of the obvious ones, which has a very strange answer. The logistical advantage that one would imagine in the United States, in New York and the Northeast particularly, would argue that the Youth Assembly at the UN would be overcrowded with U.S. citizens, New Yorkers in particular. In fact, U.S. citizens form one of the smallest components of the Youth Assembly. I'm not really sure why that is, but I do know that the UN Foundation noticed this, and in 2006 awarded us a $10,000 grant to increase our media potential throughout the United States to bring in more U.S. citizens. We have hundreds that come from around the world. 2 years ago, President Karzai sent 8 young people and his Minister of Youth from Afghanistan. And last year, for instance, we had a wonderful outpouring of young people from Latin America who came to us from Children International. Children International does an immense amount of work in Latin America, and they brought up about 35 people to the Youth Assembly. Half of those, maybe 15 or so, were young people 18 or under, probably 16 to 18, maybe even a few younger than that, who have been working on the ground in NGO projects in Latin America with Children International, primarily in health clinics, dental clinics, and the rest, who had really shown themselves to be wonderful youth humanitarians. And